Changing the world. Equal rights for women. In the interview, Deputy Head of UN Women, Lakshmi Puri.
Lakshmi Puri, you are a United Nations Assistant Secretary General and you're Deputy Head of a UN organisation, a UN agency called UN Women. It hasn't been in existence for all too long. Tell us what it's all about.
Well, it's a young, relatively small, but very dynamic agency, which was created nearly 3 years ago to promote gender equality and women's empowerment around the world. We are global advocates for this cause and this mission, which is humanity's biggest project, most important project. And we are also working on the ground in 85 countries to bring reality to the lives of women and girls in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment.
You've said your organisation is dynamic, but you've also admitted that you are small and that you are young. You've only been in existence for 3 years.
Yes.
You're telling me that you've been very successful.
Yes.
What have you achieved in those 3 years?
Well, I think our member states and our civil society friends testify to the fact that we are already a success story, even with the limited resources that we have been provided in this time, but we have leveraged, on one hand, the UN system to deliver for more, bigger, better for women and girls in terms of their own areas of action, whether it's WHO, whether it is ILO, whether it is UNESCO in education, UNICEF for girl child. So every way we have leveraged through a system-wide action plan on accountability on gender equality. We have also been very successful in one of the most important tasks we have of strengthening global norms and standards on gender equality and women's empowerment, and making sure that gender equality and women's empowerment is prioritized in every sector, whether it is in the Rio Plus 20 conference on sustainable development, where there was a recognition that women and gender equality and women's empowerment is a key driver of sustainable development, not only in its social dimension, but also in its economic and environmental sustainability dimension. So we have played that role, and through the Commission on Status of Women, which is the global body for policy making on this, again, we have really been a leader in building a whole new norm and standard on gender equality.
Okay, I'm hearing what you're saying. You've set out your stall. It's very impressive. What have you not achieved so far?
Oh, the challenge of gender equality and women's empowerment is so big that anything we do is, at this stage, only a drop in the ocean. But that drop is critical, and we have to keep filling the gaps that are gender gaps that are there across the world. There are gender gaps in terms of the poverty of women. 70% of the poorest are women. So poverty has a women's face. Education gap, the wage gap at the workplace, even here in Germany. Everywhere there are issues of culture, tradition, and mindsets to overcome, because patriarchy and inequality is so ingrained in societies, and harmful practices. So all of that is a challenge, and it is also a psychosocial issue, it's a social engineering issue, so not easy to correct in a short time, like giving a polio vaccine or providing bed nets. You've
mentioned the role of men in all this. You've mentioned the resistance of men and patriarchal structures.
Yes.
To what extent is, for you, your project, the empowerment of women, is that a joint and common project for women and for men?
Yes, it is. You see, there are two aspects to this project. One is changing the top, that is, and the pressure from the top. Governments changing laws, constitutions, adopting policies and measures that send impulses from the top down. At the same time, you need to have women and girls aware of their rights, claiming those rights. At the same time, you need men and boys also equally aware and understanding of the need for gender equality and of mutually respectful relations, and to be partners and champions. So we need feminist men.
You need feminist men and,
boys.
All that you're talking about.
Raised in that way, in a culture of gender equality and women's empowerment. And you need both men and women, boys and girls.
Yeah. You said, this is a quote from you, you said, the end of the Millennium Development Goals is fast approaching, that's 2015, but gender-related disparities are still on the rise.
Absolutely.
Progress is not being made, the disparities are on the rise.
Absolutely.
How do you account for this?
Because firstly, the Millennium Development Goals did not encompass the totality of the gender inequality and discrimination problems, particularly the underlying structural problems. And that's why UN Women, working with civil society, working with governments, has put forward for the new generation of development goals post-2015, a stand-alone, structurally transformative, human rights-based gender goal. A goal which is not just promoting gender equality like in MDG 3, but on achieving gender equality and women's empowerment and women's rights. And it has 3 elements. Ending violence.
Quick. 3 elements.
3 elements. Ending violence against women, economic empowerment and access to resources, social protection, land rights, you know, the whole gamut of economic rights, and social rights, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. And the third is voice, participation and leadership from the household to private sector to public institutions.
But what about within the United Nations framework? You have well over 100 member nations, nearer to 200 member nations. Your organisation, UN Women, you have on your executive board, I had a look at the list of names, countries like, for example, Saudi Arabia. Many women say that your organisation cannot possibly achieve its goals if it has members that do not share those goals.
Well, we are working with member countries, all types of countries. And the whole world is our theatre, of course, but we have to particularly work against the challenges in some countries and some regions of the world where, and this is the geopolitics of gender equality or inequality and discrimination, and we have to work more intensively with them and more carefully, of course, with them. And Saudi Arabia is a member of our executive board, and we are working with them as well. We are working with faith-based groups, not only the Islamic ones, but also Catholic and other religious groups who may perceive some conflict between what they see and interpret as religious precepts and gender equality and women's empowerment.
But you are talking now as the diplomat, as a United Nations diplomat, but so many women in the last 20 years or so, they've seen the whole process of gender mainstreaming, they've seen the Millennium Development Goals, they've seen post-2015 taking shape and taking form, but they don't see enough progress being made, and my sense is that a lot of women are getting very angry.
So are we, but I think we have to turn our anger and channel our anger into constructive, determined work going forward. That's why this goal is important. This will be a commitment made by all governments to their own people to hold themselves accountable to deliver on them, and also they will be held accountable by the international community, by the UN, and there will be monitoring. And there will be indicators and targets.
The accountability is so very important, but also the legal situation.
Governance has to deliver.
Governance, yes, and the legal situation is very important as well, because you've talked about the problem of sexual violence, a terrible problem, and you have said some 600 million women still live in countries where domestic violence is not even a crime.
Absolutely,
it's not a crime.
Absolutely. So that is something which UN Women has been advocating for also, but a landmark agreed conclusion was reached in the Commission on Status of Women, which looked at the 4 important and set out an action blueprint on how to deal and how to end violence against women, of all forms of violence, in all spaces, private, public, workplace. And it talked about the 4 Ps of ending violence against women and set out a plan of action for that. One is prevention. What should be done to prevent violence in all settings? Second, protection. How do you protect women and girls? Third, prosecution of perpetrators and access to justice for women, for victims and survivors. And fourth is the provision of services, multi-sectoral services, from hotlines to health services and medical support, to police registering cases, to forensic services, psychosocial counseling, and more long-term economic support to those who are victims of domestic violence, who can't go back and who need, therefore, to be supported in shelters and longer-term support systems for that. So these are, and some of the best practices we are also working on evolving on the ground in 85 countries, including carrying out a Unite campaign, including in Europe. We are working with the European Union, and we are really very, very active, because this is a crucial issue. And that's why we have put it as a target in the gender goal. It's the missing target, it's the missing goal we have had.
Lakshmi Puri, thank you very much for talking to us today, and I wish you all the very best in all your efforts.